The train whistle was a ghost itself, its mournful cry swallowed by the dense, unending woods of Kentucky. When the trees finally broke, it was not for a town, but for a wall of river stone, slick with a century of damp. The iron gate, a thing of intricate, thorny vines gone to rust, stood open, not in welcome, but like a yawning mouth. Beyond it, the Willowsong Orphanage rose against the bruised twilight sky, a hulking edifice of Victorian gloom, its windows dark and vacant as a skull's eyes. No child's laughter carried on the chill air. No sound at all, save for the ceaseless, dry rattle of the willow leaves from which it falsely took its name. The first week at Willowsong was a study in unnatural quiet. My duties were simple enough on the surface, ensuring the children were dressed, that they attended their lessons in the dusty library, that they ate their bland, unvarying meals in the cavernous dining hall. But it was the quality of their obedience that unnerved me. There were no arguments over toys, for there were no toys. There was no rushing through the long, portrait-lined corridors, only a quiet, processional walking. They moved with a synchronicity that felt rehearsed, their small faces pale and impassive as porcelain masks. Mrs. Gable was a constant, gliding presence, her keys jangling a soft, metallic chorus at her hip, a sound that seemed to regulate the very rhythm of the house. The rule was imparted to me on my second day, not as a suggestion, but as a foundational law of physics, as immutable as gravity. Mrs. Gable and I were overseeing the children during their designated recreation hour, a silent affair where they simply stood in the overgrown garden, their hands at their sides, staring at the high stone wall that encircled the property. One of the younger ones, a boy with hair the color of dust and eyes that held no childish light, had taken a single, wayward step towards a cluster of dandelions that had seeded just beyond the property's edge, near the imposing iron gate. The change in the air was instantaneous. It was not Mrs. Gable who reacted first, but the house itself. A subtle pressure drop made my ears pop, and the light seemed to dim for a fraction of a second, the shadows deepening between the trees. Mrs. Gable's hand clamped down on my arm with surprising strength, her fingers cold as river stone. "Do not let him cross," she whispered, and her voice was stripped of its usual dry rustle, replaced by a raw, sharp terror. I called out the boy's name, my own voice strangely thin in the thick air. He stopped and turned back, his expression not one of disappointment or fear, but of a profound and weary understanding. He rejoined the others without a word. Later, in the stark confines of her study, Mrs. Gable laid out the edict. "The children do not leave the grounds," she said, pouring a measure of dark, syrupy liquid into a glass. Her hand, I noted, trembled slightly. "Not for a picnic, not for a doctor's visit, not for any reason you or I could possibly conceive. The gate is the boundary. It is not locked, Mr. Evans, but it is closed to them. Forever." I, of course, protested. It was inhuman. It was imprisonment. What of fresh air, of seeing the world, of finding families? She fixed me with a gaze that was both pitying and impatient. "You misunderstand the fundamental nature of this place," she said. "They are not of the world. The world beyond that gate is a poison to their state of being. To attempt to take a child beyond it is not an act of salvation, but of annihilation. The house will not allow it." She refused to elaborate on what she meant by the house, capitalizing the word with her tone, but the dread in her eyes was a more potent explanation than any she could have uttered. The rule was not about protection from the outside, I began to realize with a creeping chill. It was about containment. The gate was not a barrier to keep the world out, but a seam, a fragile lock on a door that must, at all costs, remain shut. And I was now one of its keepers, tasked with upholding a law whose consequences I could not comprehend, but whose violation was spoken of in the same hushed, fearful tones as a blasphemy against God. The truth did not come from Mrs. Gable, nor from any of the old, leather-bound ledgers in the library whose pages listed names and dates of arrival but never any departures. It came from Elara, the smallest of them all, a girl who seemed to be woven from moonlight and silence. She never spoke during lessons or meals, her presence so faint she was like a smudge on the air, a ghost even among ghosts. I found her one evening after supper, not in the dormitory with the others, but standing alone in the deepest shadows of the foyer, her small hand pressed flat against the faded floral pattern of the wallpaper. She was perfectly still, her head cocked as if listening to a whisper only she could hear. A sudden, profound pity welled up in me, a desperate, human need to offer some scrap of comfort in this place that had none. I knelt beside her, the ancient floorboards groaning under my weight. "Ilara," I said softly, "you must miss having a mother, a father. Don't you ever wonder about them? About where you came from before this place?" She didn't look at me, her gaze still fixed on the wall. Her voice, when it came, was not the high, piping tone of a child, but something far older, a dry rustle of leaves in a forgotten attic. "We don't get born," she said, the grammar simple, the meaning anything but. The words hung in the cold air, simple and absolute. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it, to fit her statement into the fractured logic of a traumatized child. An orphan's fantasy, a story told to make sense of an unbearable reality. "Everyone is born, Ilara," I said, my own voice sounding foolish and fragile. "You had a mother who held you, surely." Slowly, her head turned. Her eyes, in the gloom, were not the eyes of a little girl. They were deep, still pools reflecting an impossible span of time. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, a gesture that held no joy, only a bottomless, weary knowledge. "No one held us," she whispered. "The house just finds us. When it's quiet. When you're lost in the dark between places. It finds you, and then you are here. And you can't get dead." The finality in that last phrase stole the breath from my lungs. You can't get dead. It wasn't a statement of hope or resilience. It was a curse, a description of a terminal state of being. My mind recoiled, scrambling for purchase. I thought of the pristine, unused infirmary, the utter lack of any concern for illness or injury among the staff. I thought of the children's unchanging faces, the way a scratch from a thorn bush in the garden would be gone by the next morning without a trace. They weren't immortal in the glorious sense of myth, they were static, trapped in a state of perpetual existence, their very biology seemingly an extension of the house's will. They hadn't arrived through the natural order of life and death, they had been collected. Plucked from some unknown obscurity and anchored here, their being now inextricably tied to the rotting timber and river stone of Willowsong. Ilara was not a child who had lost her parents. She was something for which there was no word, a soul that had never known a beginning and was now forever denied an end. The orphanage was not a way station for the living, it was a permanent exhibit in a museum of arrested time, and we, the caregivers, were not tending to children. We were curators of the never-born and the never-dying, minding the exhibits in a gallery of the forever lost. The conviction became a splinter in my mind, festering with each passing day of unnatural silence. The rule, Ilara's revelation, they were no longer abstract horrors but a cage whose bars were made of twisted reality itself. I could not abide it. The sight of their quiet, resigned faces in the perpetual twilight of the house, the knowledge of their endless, unchanging sentence, became an unbearable weight on my soul. It fell upon me, the only one who still possessed the capacity for outrage, to break the cycle. I chose Thomas, a boy who sometimes, in rare unguarded moments, would look toward the iron gate with a flicker of something that might have been longing. My plan was simple, born of a desperate, foolish hope in a place that consumed hope. I would wait for the deepest hour of the night, when even Mrs. Gable's ceaseless patrols seemed to pause, and I would take him. Not for an adoption, not for a new life, but for the simple, profound act of proving that the boundary could be crossed. The house was a tomb, the only sound the frantic thudding of my own heart as I led Thomas, his small hand cold and trusting in mine, down the grand staircase. He did not speak, only followed, his eyes wide and unreadable in the slivers of moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The front door groaned on its hinges, a sound like a wounded animal, and the night air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, washed over us. It felt different outside, charged and watchful. The iron gate stood 20 yards away, a jagged silhouette against the starless dark of the woods. Each step across the overgrown gravel path was a battle, a sensation of wading through deepening water, the air growing thick and resistant. Thomas began to whimper, a low, terrified sound. "It's pulling," he whispered, his voice strained. "The house is pulling on my insides." Just a little farther, I urged, my own breath coming in ragged gasps. My muscles screamed with the effort, as if I were dragging us both through hardening concrete. The gate was right there, the world beyond it a deeper shade of black, an unknown freedom. With a final, Herculean surge of will, I clutched Thomas tight and lunged the last few steps, my body breaking through the invisible barrier of the gate's archway. For a single, dizzying moment, I felt a surge of triumph. We were out. We had done it. The cold night air was on my face, the crunch of foreign gravel beneath my boots. Then, the world dissolved into a nauseating smear of shadows and a sound like tearing silk. There was no sense of movement, only a violent, instantaneous displacement. The night, the trees, the taste of free air, it all vanished, replaced by the suffocating familiarity of beeswax and dust. The transition was so abrupt it left me disoriented and physically sick. I stumbled, my knees buckling, and found myself on my hands and knees, retching onto the intricate, threadbare pattern of the rug in the main foyer. The grand chandelier hung overhead, its crystals tinkling softly as if disturbed by a breeze that did not exist. Thomas stood a few feet away, perfectly composed, his small face pale and calm. He was smoothing down the front of his nightshirt, his earlier terror gone, replaced by that ancient, weary resignation. There was no memory of our flight in his eyes, only the quiet acceptance of his eternal present. My own memories of the event were already fraying at the edges, the details, the feel of his hand, the crunch of the gravel, the surge of hope, bleeding away like ink in water, leaving behind only the cold, hard, unassailable fact of our failure. We had never left. The house had simply refused to let us go, and in its refusal, it had rewritten the event itself, erasing our transgression as if it were nothing more than a bad dream, leaving us trapped in the waking nightmare of its endless, silent halls. The failed escape broke something in me, not my spirit, but my perception of the reality I was trapped within. I now saw the house not as a building, but as a living, breathing entity, and its silence was not an absence of sound, but a held breath. The children, in their placid acceptance, were its organs, and I was a foreign agent, a bacterium it had not yet decided how to expel or absorb. It was in the deep, still hours before dawn that the change began. I had taken to wandering the halls, a futile attempt to map the contours of my prison, when I first heard it, a low, rhythmic murmur, like a distant hive. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, a vibration felt in the teeth more than heard by the ears. I followed the sound, my candle guttering in a cold draft that had no source, its flame the only point of warmth in the encroaching chill. The murmur led me to the door of the main dormitory. I pressed my ear to the heavy oak, and the sound clarified, resolving not into a hive, but into words, a single phrase repeated in a dozen whispering, childish voices, all speaking in perfect, chilling unison. "It is hungry," they whispered, the words slithering through the wood grain. "The quiet one walks. It is hungry for an end." My blood turned to ice. This was not the simple, eerie truth Ilara had shared. This was a chorus, a single consciousness speaking through many throats. I cracked the door open, the scene inside freezing the very air in my lungs. The children were all sitting upright in their beds, their faces tilted toward the ceiling, their eyes wide, white, and utterly vacant. They did not move, did not blink. Their chests did not rise or fall with breath. They were dolls, vessels, and from their open mouths came that unified, ancient whisper. "It knows your want for an end. It tastes your mortality. It is a flavor it has forgotten." The voice was a composite, a thing of layered frequencies, the high, pure tones of youth woven through with a guttural, phlegmy rasp that spoke of unimaginable age. It was the house, and it was using them, speaking through them as one might flex a finger. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the opposite wall with a dull thud. As one, the heads of every child in the room swiveled toward the sound, their blank eyes fixing on me through the open doorway. The whispering stopped. The silence that rushed in was more terrifying than the chant, a predatory, attentive silence. Then, from every single one of them, a single word was spoken, their voices once again their own, yet carrying the same chilling finality. "Soon." The door swung shut of its own accord, the latch clicking into place with the sound of a final judgment. I was left alone in the corridor, the echo of that unified whisper coiled around my heart. They were not just prisoners, they were its nervous system, its voice, and now, it had spoken to me directly. It had tasted my desire for an ending, for the very death it denied its charges, and it had found that desire interesting. I was no longer just a keeper. I was being considered. The house had spoken, and in its utterance, it had given me a direction, a terrible purpose. The whispers in the dark, the failed escape, the children's vacant-eyed pronouncements, they were not random horrors. They were symptoms, clues pointing toward a central, festering truth. The house was not merely a sentient building, it was a system, and like any system, it had to have a heart, a source from which its unnatural laws emanated. My nightly wanderings, once born of desperation, now became a grim investigation. I searched for the silence within the silence, for the place where the oppressive atmosphere of the house was not a presence, but an absence so complete it became a thing in itself. It was in the dust-shrouded basement, behind a shelf of preserved, unblinking glass jars containing things I dared not identify, that I found it, a door not made of wood, but of cast iron, cold and seamless, set directly into the stone foundation. There was no handle, no keyhole, only a single, tarnished silver button set in its center, pulsing with a faint, sickly light as if in time with some subterranean heartbeat. This was the source of the pull Thomas had felt. This was the engine of their endless, static existence. Using a rusted crowbar I'd found amidst the coal scuttles, I pried at the edges of the door, but it was like trying to lever open a bank vault. The metal did not so much as scratch. It was only when, in a fit of frustrated rage, I slammed my palm against the cold surface that the silver button flared with a blinding, actinic light. A series of clicks, like bones snapping, echoed from within the thickness of the door, and it swung inward without a sound, revealing not a room, but a void. A staircase, hewn from the same black, polished stone as the walls, spiraled down into a darkness that seemed to drink the very light from my candle. The air that wafted up was ancient and sterile, carrying the scent of ozone and cold stone, and beneath it, a faint, sweet odor of decay that was not physical, but spiritual. Descending was like walking into the gullet of a leviathan. The stairs coiled tightly, the walls pressing close, their surfaces unnaturally smooth and cold. The silence here was absolute, a vacuum that threatened to pull the thoughts from my head. After what felt like an eternity of descent, the staircase opened into a chamber that defied all geometry. It was vast, impossibly so, its ceiling lost in a gloom that shimmered with faint, star-like pinpricks of cold light. The center of the chamber was dominated by a massive, obsidian plinth, and upon it rested the heart of the horror. It was not a machine, nor a pulsating organ, but a sphere of what appeared to be solidified shadow, a knot of absolute blackness that twisted the light around it. Within its depths, I could see faint, swirling motes of light, not stars, but souls, tiny, trapped fragments of consciousness writhing in an eternal, silent scream. Tendrils of the same black substance, like petrified veins, radiated from the sphere and vanished into the stone of the walls and ceiling, feeding the entire house above. This was the anchor. This was the thing that found the lost and quiet ones, that pulled them from whatever between place they inhabited and tethered them here. It did not create life, it parasitized potential. It did not grant immortality, it enforced a perpetual, agonizing stasis, feeding on the very concept of an ending. The children upstairs were not its children, they were its fuel, their UN-lived lives and UN-died deaths siphoned away to sustain this ancient, ravenous hunger at the center of the world. The orphanage was not a home. It was a farm, and this dark, beating heart in the earth was its rancher, cultivating a crop of souls that would never seed, never bloom, and never, ever be allowed to wither and return to the earth.